When you start exercising, when the gun fires, let's say you're in an 800 meter or 1500 meter middle distance track race, the speed with which you can turn on that aerobic system to supply oxygen to your muscles and to utilize that oxygen is really important. So you've got to have a really high VO2 max in the first place if you want to be a world record holder in an endurance sport. So I'm not diminishing, the value and the importance of having a high VO2 max. But once you've got it, there are certainly other things that can improve, which in concert with your high VO2 max will result in you getting better and better. So all of a sudden, everything's out of equilibrium. You've lost your homeostasis, which of course as humans, as mammals, we always lack homeostasis, whether it's temperature or whether it's acid base or whatever. But we've got beyond this threshold where that's manageable. I'm often asked the question, why didn't we have a sports psychologist for breaking two? And it never crossed our minds, because the guys that we were working with, they were so mentally tough. They were, it was almost an insult to them to say to them, we can make you better psychologically.
Welcome to this new episode. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our sponsor for the podcast, Moxy Monitor. If you've been following my work, you know that the Moxy is a tool that I use a lot for testing, but also for everyday training and coaching. For those who don't know about the Moxy Monitor yet, it's a NIRS device that measures muscle oxygen saturation and blood volume in real time. It's a non-invasive sensor that is placed on the skin and can be worn during any training or sporting activity. Motocross riders and climbers wear it on their forearms. Hockey players on the ice, swimmers can wear it in water. I've used it to test rugby players, CrossFit athletes, endurance athletes, and more. The Moxy allows you to individualize work and rest periods, optimize load, reps and sets, identify training thresholds in real time, and even correct movement based on what the data shows you. You can also use the Moxy Monitor to determine an athlete's energetic limiting factor and their individual training zones. Using this process, I can now target the athlete's limiter with precision in order to improve their performance without adding unnecessary volume to their program. You can view and collect the data on your Garmin watch, and can also pair the Moxy with other physiological testing products such as the VO2 Master, Pnoe, and Cosmed VO2 systems. The Moxy is a product I've been using for many months with great success, and I highly recommend it to any coach who's interested in digging a little bit deeper on the physiological side of health, fitness, or performance. You can use the coupon UPSIDE at checkout for a 5% discount on moxymonitor.com/shop. That's UPSIDE, UPSIDE, for a 5% discount. With that said, let's get into the show. Okay, Andy, we're live on the podcast. How you doing?
All right, thanks. Yeah, how are you?
Doing great. It's good to have you on. Get someone that walks the walk and does the research as well. I guess I'll let you present yourself for the few people that may not know who you are. Who are you and what do you do? Let's start with that.
Okay, I'm Andy Jones. I'm a professor of applied physiology at the University of Exeter, down in the southwest of England in the UK. I've been here since 2005. I'm administratively and managementally, if that's a word, I'm the assistant deputy Vice-Chancellor for research at the moment as well. So quite heavily involved in that kind of thing. But I research things that relate to human exercise performance, especially with regard to endurance. And I guess I'm all things VO2. So what determines efficiency and economy, VO2 max, VO2 kinetics, high sustainable VO2, that kind of stuff. So I do quite a bit of research in the lab, which looks at the fundamental underpinnings to those concepts and what determines fatigue, etc. But I'm also quite keen to apply that work in the field too. So I've done a lot of work over the years with distance runners in particular. I was going to say endurance athletes, but it's really focused on middle and long distance running. Did a lot of work with UK Athletics in particular, English Institute of Sport, and I was consultant on Nike's Breaking 2 marathon project as well, which was obviously very exciting.
Mm-hmm. In the realm of that, applied physiology, let's talk about the work you've done in the endurance running field. When people think about that middle to long distance running and performance, for you, what are the key underlying factors that we have to consider if we want to A, get better, and B, excel at those kind of events?
Yeah, it's the kind of standard stuff that you'll have heard about before. I mean, it is, when you get beyond, let's say, 90 seconds or 2 minutes, it's predominantly oxidative energy that propels you. And therefore we are interested in oxygen uptake, all things VO2 really. Mm-hmm. And it's all of those bits and pieces that I described described earlier, your VO2 max is one thing. What's the highest rate at which you can take oxygen from the air that you breathe, transport it to your mitochondria and use it? But having a high VO2 max in and of itself isn't sufficient. You need to be able to use that oxidative energy efficiently as well. So the effectiveness with which you translate that generation of oxidative ATP into speed across the ground is important. So things like cycling, we talk about cycling efficiency. For running, it's running economy. So you run a bunch of people at exactly the same speed, and some people use more oxygen and therefore more energy than other people. So they've clearly got different biomechanics and different physiology, which explains that. But then the other aspect to it is, what fraction of your VO2 max can you run at for long periods? What can you sustain without rapid fatigue? So there's a certain submaximal work rate or running speed for everybody below which you can reach a steady state VO2. And if your VO2 is steady state, then a bunch of other things are steady state as well. But you go above that speed or that power output, call it critical speed or critical power, and then all of a sudden your oxygen uptake isn't steady anymore, and it starts to gradually creep up. Not always quite so gradually, depends on the intensity of the work. And ultimately you'll hit your VO2 max. And again, while your VO2 is projecting upwards, lots of other things are either projecting upwards or downwards at the same time. So there's this metabolic rate, which basically, above or below which will determine whether you're able to sustain homeostasis or not. And that has massive implications for the fatigue process and therefore for endurance as well. And the final thing that I've been interested in for a while, and it's the overlooked, it's kind of the fourth dimension, I suppose, is VO2 kinetics. So for middle distance events, this is especially important because when you start exercising, when the gun fires, let's say you're in an 800 meter or 1500 meter middle distance track race, the speed with which you can turn on that aerobic system to supply oxygen to your muscles and to utilize that oxygen is really important. It's not just the maximum rate that you reach, it's how rapidly you reach that maximum rate. Mm-hmm. So some people have faster VO2 kinetics than others, and the faster your VO2 kinetics following the onset of exercise, the less you'll have to switch on, or draw upon the anaerobic mechanisms. And again, there are fatigue implications in all of that.
Okay, so if I understand you correctly, you want to get to that, let's call it maximum metabolic steady state as soon as possible, and then do all your work there. Try not to go above that line and quote unquote dip into your reserves. What is that a correct kind of summary of what you said, or?
Yeah, well, it depends on the distance a bit, right, that you're racing over. So, if you're running 1500 meters, you're going to be way above your critical speed. Mm-hmm. In fact, the intensity is going to be above your VO2 max. So mm-hmm. There's an obligatory anaerobic contribution, but you've only got a certain finite amount of anaerobic energy that you can use. And so the more aerobic energy that you can generate over the course of that distance, the faster you'll go overall. You see what I mean? Because if you use all that anaerobic energy early because your VO2 hasn't risen quickly enough, then you'll fatigue quickly and you just won't run very fast. Whereas if you've got the same amount of anaerobic energy, but you can switch on your aerobic machinery much more rapidly, then you can contribute more aerobic energy to the total amount you can supply, which in itself is going to be larger, and that should result in you going faster. But you certainly got for much longer distances, let's say the marathon now, you've got to be careful that you don't go above your critical speed if you're running a marathon. Yeah. Maybe in the last couple of 100 meters, but going above it will cause lots of things. Your muscle glycogen will become depleted more rapidly. You'll accumulate hydrogen ions and lactate in your muscles and lactate in your blood and so on, and that's not positive for your performance. So knowing what that highest sustainable oxidative metabolic rate is, and being cautious with how and when you encroach or exceed that is going to be a factor that will determine to some extent your performance.
So if to maybe translate into terms that I understand, you talked about critical speed. And when we go above that critical speed, we've got the D prime, I think is what it's called. And if we use that model, so essentially you want to dip into your D prime as little as possible. You want to just stay into the or under under the critical speed threshold. I understand myself. I don't know if that makes any sense, but essentially that reserve that's above that critical or that metabolic steady state, you want to use that as little as possible. Is that when we talk
Yeah,
about VO2 kinetics?
Sure. Well, yeah, when ultimately, when you cross the finish line, you want to have used all of that as well.
Yes. Yeah. But you have to make sure you don't burn it early. So
yeah,
because you're gonna get to a point where there's nothing left, and you want that to be on the finish line and not before.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you've got to be careful you don't burn it off too, because you'll make a rod for your own back if you burn that up too quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you want to have it all completely depleted by the time you hit the finish line, but not really much before that. I would be a bit careful with when we're talking about exercising above and below critical speed. That's one component to all of this, which we've just discussed. VO2 kinetics is a related concept, but also you could consider it separately as well, which is that's really more to do with just how, forget about whether you're getting to a speed or an oxygen uptake that's above or below that critical threshold at the moment, irrespective of where your VO2 is eventually going to project to. The faster you can get there, irrespective of whether it's above or below your critical power or critical speed, the better, because you'll incur less of an oxygen deficit, and you'll lose less or use less of that D prime or W prime as well in the process, for sure.
So I want to come back to this concept of VO2 kinetics, because it's really interesting to me. Now, from the different, let's say the pillars of performance when it comes to endurance running, you talked about running economy and VO2 max as some of them. From your perspective and your understanding, which ones are the most influenced by genetics, and which ones have the biggest potential for improvement through training in general?
It's a good question. I don't think we really know exactly the answer to that question. I think they're all determined to some extent by genetics and to some extent by training. The general viewpoint is that VO2 max is more set by genetics, that there is some kind of ultimate limit to that. I mean, there's an ultimate limit to everything, but you could argue that VO2 max is pretty set, and you may not be able to do much in training to influence it. I think there'd be people who disagree with that. But we do know that things like running economy and the fraction of VO2 max that you can sustain for long periods are very trainable. So yeah, a classic example of it is a paper that I published a while ago with Paula Radcliffe, the former world marathon record holder. And I sort of published a paper because I worked with her throughout her entire career. And when she was 18, her VO2 max was, I think, about 72 mils per kilogram per minute, extraordinarily high. But when she set the world record for the marathon 12 years later, it was still about 72 mils per kilogram per minute. And she clearly got much better in that 12-year period. And yet her VO2 max hadn't changed. So clearly there were other things that had improved that were able to explain that better performance. So you've got to have a really high VO2 max in the first place if you want to be a world record holder in an endurance sport. So I'm not diminishing, the value and the importance of having a high VO2 max. But once you've got it, there are certainly other things that can improve, which in concert with your high VO2 max will result in you getting better and better. And with Paula, it was the two of the other things that we've mentioned. One was her running economy. She got much more economical as the years went by, and various explanations for that. I think she was just accumulating more miles, just being really consistent with her training. There's a big biomechanical or technical component to running economy, and if you do a lot of running, your body's going to adapt such that you spare energy. Your running technique becomes much less wasteful as the years go by. And then the other thing she was better able to do, I think she gave her muscles much more better oxidative capacity, more mitochondria, more oxidative enzymes, which meant that despite her VO2 max not changing, she was able to operate at a higher and higher fraction of that VO2 max and still be in a steady state. So that threshold bit alongside the running economy, there's probably some genetic limitation to that as well. I mean, some people are gifted in those respects, but they certainly seem to be more amenable, more plastic to training.
When you talk about the technical component of running, is that something that is worked on specifically with the coaches, reviewing video, reviewing her form, or reviewing her form through her training? Or like you said, is it quote unquote simply an adaptation of the miles that you're going to log every day, every week, and year after year?
Yeah, the endurance runners don't generally do much in the way of that kind of technical training. You know, you see sprinters do all sorts of drills, high knees and bounding and whatever. The distance runners don't really do that, and so I don't think it's that. It's simply that your body irons out any slightly peculiar traits that you might have. You know, you might have a slightly wild arm action, or you might have a wastefully high knee lift, or your center of gravity might, it might all bob a bit too much. But over time, all of that just gets honed, so you just become a more efficient machine, and all that energy that you're expending becomes better directed from taking you horizontally from A to B.
Mm. And if you talk about that metabolic efficiency, or the ability to operate at a higher and higher percentage of your VO2 over time, you talked about the different developments that happen at the muscular level. What are the primary training methods and approaches in order to incur those different adaptations? And from what you were saying, it seems to be that even far into an athlete's career, you can still see meaningful adaptations from this kind of work. What comes to mind for me is zone 2, that kind of steady state work. Is that what we're talking about, or is there other components to that?
Again, the research on this isn't especially clear, so we have to kind of intuit some of this. And I think probably what you need in any training program is to have sessions that stimulate all of those different factors that we've just described. So you can't afford to neglect your VO2 max. As you get older, it has the potential to fall. So there are muscular metabolic adaptations, which we've discussed a little bit already, but clearly there are cardiovascular adaptations as well, one of which is that, the ability to supply oxygen to the muscles is a big thing, and that depends upon adequate ventilation, obviously, which is normally not a problem. And then it depends a lot on your maximal cardiac output, which in turn depends upon your stroke volume and your heart rate. Okay. And then, of course, you've got to make sure you've got enough hemoglobin to transport that oxygen to your muscles. But if we concentrate on the heart for a moment, one of the key adaptations to endurance training is you get a larger left ventricle, basically. So you get a higher volume there, which means that every time your heart beats, your left ventricle ejects more blood into the aorta. And of course, at rest, when you've got a specific demand for a particular cardiac output, if your stroke volume is a lot higher, then your heart rate is necessarily lower. So we find that in the elite endurance athletes have extremely low resting heart rates, often in the 30s. Mm-hmm. So half of what you'd find in a regular person. But of course, when we're talking about maximal cardiac output, you're going to have your maximal stroke volume and your maximal heart rate. But we know that as you get older, your maximal heart rate goes down a little bit. It goes down by approximately 1 beat per minute every year. So, you're going to be fighting against a potentially falling. So if your VO2 max is going to be going down between the age of, say, 30 and 40, which it almost inevitably will, you have to find some way to compensate for that. And so you have to improve one of those submaximal indices, like your running economy or your threshold or your critical speed. I mean, I think one way by which you might be able to prevent a fall in VO2 max is to ensure that you continue to stimulate your VO2 max with specific training sessions. And that might, so the trouble for runners often, they start as middle distance athletes, and then they gradually over the course of their career, gravitate towards longer and longer distances, and therefore they kind of neglect the high intensity work that might be necessary to maintain their VO2 max at a high level. So I think doing sessions at least once a week, which gets your heart rate very close to its maximum, and you do that as an interval session so that you spend as many minutes, lots of minutes at close to maximal heart rate than you would be able to do if you just did it in one continuous bout. That's important. So you've got to have that intensity in there, and you could do something like, say 5 times 1,000 meters, pretty hard with a minute or two in between, or you could do something like, say 15 times 400 meters, really fast with about a minute in between, or sessions like that. are going to get your heart rate and your VO2 up towards their maximum level. So that's one session you should certainly do. You've got to do a certain total volume of training, which is appropriate to the distance that you're training to compete over. That's certain. And making sure you're not doing too, if you do too much mileage, then obviously the mean speed of that is going to be lower than if you did a slightly smaller mileage. And then you go, so getting the balance, should you be doing 50 miles a week, 70 miles a week, 100 miles a week, whatever, depends on a lot of factors. But the mix of training that you do, the easy runs, the steady runs, the tempo runs, the interval runs, in concert should be sufficient to keep your running economy improving. But when it comes to how do you increase your critical speed, then you mentioned zone 2. I mean, people have different understandings of what all these different zones are, of course. But my view certainly is that if you want to improve your threshold, if you want to call it that, or the fraction of your VO2 max that you can sustain for long periods and still be in a steady state, or your critical speed, whichever of those terms you want to use, you've got to do a reasonable volume of your continuous steady state work at a speed that is quite close to that. It doesn't have to encroach, it doesn't have to exceed it, but it should be, doing too much just long, slow, easy and a few intervals isn't going to cut it, in my view. I'm not a proponent of the 80-20. I think there's a huge, important zone in the middle that you have to hit. And making sure that you don't run your steady, continuous runs too slowly all of the time, I think is important. Doesn't mean you shouldn't have recovery runs and easy runs, etc., etc. So there's that bit, but then there's something called tempo runs or threshold runs, whatever you want to call those, where you deliberately go just above this threshold or this critical speed. Might only be for 10 or 20 minutes, but you put the body in that situation where it is forced to adapt to that. It's not pleasant. It will be, you'll be breathing hard, you'll be accumulating or depleting all sorts of, metabolites at a certain rate. But forcing your body is one of the best sessions you can do, I think. And it's so specific to the type of experience, type of fatigue you'll experience in a race that you really can't shy away from it. But so if so that's the science, but the art is creating a training program that combines all of that stuff in the perfect week. And it brings a person, to better and better fitness and closer to optimal performance at the right rate without doing too much and risking injury or illness. That's the art of it, which we're all still wrestling with. That was a really long answer, but it was such a good question.
Thank you. And like you said, all the components, we know of them. They might have different names within different frameworks or different approaches, or coming from different coaches, but then the consistency of that over time, and like you said, over many years, is what is going to get you to the highest possible levels or to the closest to your individual potential. And in that, like you said, there's the recovery, there's the sleep, there's the not getting injured, because I mean, it has to be a big part of endurance sports, especially on the recreational side. Is you can do all the hard training that you want. If you're hurt half the time, you're losing days, you're losing weeks, you're losing months on that training process and those adaptations that take such a long time to occur.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you over that. And the best endurance athletes are those that are actually really patient. And it doesn't mean that they don't train really hard, but they train at a level that they know exactly how hard to train and when to take a day's rest or just to back off. And they don't train as hard as they can all of the time in training. And therefore, they become resilient and they don't, honestly, it's better to train at 90% of your full capacity 350 days of the year than to train at 100% of it for 200 days because you've ended up ill or injured. And the best athletes and the best coach-athlete combinations know how to manage that load really effectively. But you're right, especially for the marathon, it might be that you don't reach your full potential until you're in your 30s, right? So that's a long career to manage, and it might take that long for your running economy to get to the perfect. And your VO2 max might not have changed very much, but it's going to take that long for your running economy to be as good as it possibly could be, and for your muscle oxidative capacity to get to where it wants to be as well. But that's a long haul, and so you don't just have to have the physiology and the genetics and to do the training, but you also have to have the psychological wherewithal to withstand that, to really play the long game, and it's literally you train, eat, sleep, just do that. It's like a monastic or a existence for decades. You do it day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, and you don't get distracted by anything else. And that takes a certain very special mentality. So the best athletes that I've worked with aren't just the best athletes in terms of their physical caliber, but they've got the right mental faculties as well, so that they can get the most from their innate physiology and from the training that they're prepared to undertake over extreme time span. And you can be talking 15 or 20 years.
For that mental aspect that you just mentioned, it's obviously something that is more and more talked about: mental preparation, visualization. Are those things that in those top like world level athletes that you've worked with, are those things that are addressed on a coaching basis, or is that something that has maybe emerged through the process of training, that continuous, I want to say grind, even though it's not the right term, but just being at it, like you said, every single day for years and years? Is it just a mindset that those folks have? Is that something that can be improved to some extent?
Another really great question. I mean, you asked me the question, is it genetic or training? And that was all about the sort of physiology aspect. But we tend not to ask the same question when it comes to the psychology. My own view is that there's definitely some kind of genetic contribution to that as well. That these top athletes seem to have this inherent ability. Certainly, when I met Paula Radcliffe when she was 17 or 18, she already had those psychological traits. She knew how to hurt herself. When she was training and racing, she was resilient. She could tolerate pain. She had the motivation. She had the determination, and she didn't let that wane. And she had unshakable belief and self-confidence that it would come good. It's not to say that people don't have their moments where they have some self-doubt, but they certainly don't seem to show it too often. So I think, while certainly there are limits to how far you can get with your performance from a physical or physiological perspective, there are certainly things you can certainly improve that. I'm of the view, probably, I think, that you've either got it mentally or you haven't, to a greater extent than you do with the physiology.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly there would be some sports psychologists, I'm sure, who are listening, who would totally disagree with that. And I don't disagree that there are things you can do to be more aware and to improve, to do the visualization. There are certain psychological skill sets you can develop that will improve your performance. I'm often asked the question, why didn't we have a sports psychologist for Breaking 2? And it never crossed our minds, because the guys that we were working with, they were so mentally tough. They were, it was almost an insult to them just to say to them, we can make you better psychologically, because I honestly think they were sublime already. I think the psychologists would like to talk to some of these champion athletes, because they've learned such a lot from them.
Yeah, it's a good way to put it the other way around, to maybe gain a few insights on how they think in order to do the things that they do every day of the week. I want to go back under the hood a little bit and talk, like I said, about VO2 kinetics. So from your understanding, what are the determining factors of said VO2 kinetics, and how can it be improved through training?
The first bit's a little bit easier than the second. So obviously we're talking about oxygen uptake, which in itself is a rate, but we're talking about how rapidly that can be accelerated when you start to exercise. And there's two possible elements to it. One is, are you getting enough oxygen delivered to your muscles, and are your muscles able to extract and utilize the oxygen that's been received? And there's been a bit of a polarized debate around that over the years. Some people saying, well, the reason you can't accelerate your VO2 more rapidly is because there's a lag in the rate at which you're receiving oxygen at the muscle. And there are those who say, well, actually, if you look at heart rate kinetics and cardiac output kinetics and muscle blood flow kinetics, that's actually faster than muscle VO2 kinetics. So it doesn't seem to be that there's a lack of oxygen available. It seems to be that the muscle, for whatever reason, in those first few seconds, just isn't able to use it properly. The oxidative machinery, the oxidative enzymes within the mitochondria don't seem to be, for whatever reason, sufficiently turned on to use it properly. It also seems to be the case that in order to stimulate the mitochondria to increase their rate of oxygen consumption, that there has to be some obligatory anaerobic contribution. So you start to utilize ATP initially, and then to replenish that ATP, you use phosphocreatine. And when the phosphocreatine goes down and the ATP goes down, your creatine goes up, your ADP goes up, your PI goes up. And those seem to be metabolic signals which actually get the mitochondria to think, oh, hang on, we better up our game here, and we better use this oxygen. So there is an obligatory anaerobic, the whole thing has to be kick-started by some anaerobic contribution before the mitochondria kick in. So, but it seems to be controlled really very locally at the level of the muscle cell. Mm-hmm. So that's the thing. So interestingly, although the middle distance athletes would benefit more from having very fast VO2 kinetics, because the demand, when you fire the gun, they start really, really fast, right? And so the demand relative to where they're at is really high. So it would be absolutely beneficial if they could accelerate their VO2 towards that requirement really rapidly, so they incur less of an oxygen deficit and have to use less anaerobic energy in that initial minute or so. So they would benefit more, but their kinetics are a bit slower than the marathon runners. Now, the marathon runners, they start running. Of course, it's fast, but it's not as fast as if you're a 1,500-meter runner. And of course, you're going for two hours plus, right? So the period of time over which the VO2 kinetics is relevant is vanishingly small compared to if you're an 800-meter runner. So the marathon runners don't necessarily need to have very fast VO2 kinetics, but they do. So they're really, they have a time constant of about 10 seconds, whereas even your best middle distance runners probably have a time constant of 25 seconds.
What can you explain time constant for those who might not be familiar with it?
Yeah, time constant is the time it takes to go from whatever your baseline VO2 is to whatever your VO2 needs to be for the speed that you're running at. Okay. Mm-hmm. The time constant is 63% of that difference. It's weird that it's 63%, but it just
because of the shape of the curve.
Yeah, shape of the curve.
Okay.
So basically, within 4 time constants, you've reached the steady state. So if you've got a time constant of 10 seconds, you've pretty much got to that new requirement. 40 or so seconds, you're pretty much there. Mm-hmm. If your time constant is 25 seconds, it's going to be 100 seconds before you get anywhere near the VO2 that you need to be at. Mm-hmm. And while you're not at that steady state, you're having to use non-oxidative energy supply, which isn't necessarily a good thing.
And so like from what I understand, we talk about oxygen delivery or uptake and delivery when we talk about those VO2 kinetics. Is it about, to talk maybe more simplistically so I can understand it, is it about turning on the heart and the vasculature and the respiratory system faster? Is it about this, or is it really at the metabolic level, at the muscular level that this VO2 kinetics, or where the rubber hits the road, so to speak?
Yeah, so it seems to be at the muscle level. So our hearts, your heart rate and your stroke volume go up pretty much straight away. If you look at the rate at which blood flow is increasing in the femoral artery, it's really rapid. It's faster than the muscle is able to use it. So there's like a period of time where the arterial to venous oxygen difference doesn't change, and it's simply because the muscle is. So it's definitely about the oxidative machinery within the muscle cells, and which is why the marathon runners have really high muscle oxidative capacity, and that's why their kinetics are so fast. So if we want to get our kinetics faster, we probably need to do more aerobic training, which means that we'll be able to use that oxygen more rapidly. The trouble is, if you're a middle distance runner, you don't want to have the you can't have the oxidative capacity of a marathon runner, because you're going to compromise your anaerobic capacity, which is necessary for you to run a really fast 800 meters. So we're between a rock and a hard place on that one.
Is that the balance between And just, I've got a couple notes here because there was a very interesting presentation on the ECSS 5 years ago, I believe, by Dr. Vanatalo. And she was talking about the metabolic demands of the critical power. And essentially it's there's a close relationship, or there's a tie, how to say that? Whatever's under critical speed and whatever is above is coupled. And so you can't increase one without decreasing the other in some sense. And so like you say, you need that quote unquote anaerobic contribution if you want to be fast on those middle distances or shorter distances. So you can't push that line too high. Is that kind of where we are?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So for any given event, you have to have the appropriate balance, I suppose, between critical speed and what physiology that represents, and D prime and the physiology that represents. So if you're a miler, you've got to have the right combination. If you've got a massive critical speed, but your D prime's not very good, then all of a sudden a mile isn't your best event anymore. You know, you probably should be running 5K or 10K. So, but yeah, she's right there. That like for example, when you do endurance training, your critical speed will go up, but your D prime tends to go down. And I think the reason being, if you imagine that let's say the VO2 max doesn't really change very much with training, and the endurance training program brings your critical speed closer to that max, you know, you've now got a smaller difference between where your critical speed is and where your VO2 max is. And that bit is your anaerobic capacity, essentially. So by increasing the one, you naturally reduce the magnitude of the other. So you know, it's probably, you know, if you're a sprinter, you probably don't want to be doing too much aerobic work at all. If you're a 100-meter sprinter, you know, you want massive anaerobic capacity, don't you? So you probably shouldn't even be walking around the shops or anything like that. You want to be carried to the track and just be very explosive in everything that you do.
And like you said, those middle distances require a careful balance between the two, and so you have to be sure to not overload the system with too much of the quote unquote slower work, even though it's not slow, but it's slower than the faster work, so to speak. Yeah. If we use that threshold as a middle point, or as a balance point, let's say between the two, so it's got to be carefully managed. Last thing I want to talk about with you today, Andy, is metabolic steady state. So that, like you said, there seems to be a lot of things that stay in balance as long as we're just below or at that critical speed. If we stay on the running side of things, what goes first when you pass that threshold? What is the first, let's say maybe piece or domino that's gonna fall, and that's gonna incur all those other metabolic disturbances or metabolite accumulation and other processes that result in the effort becoming unsustainable over time?
Good question. Well, I think what basically happens is that when you increase your speed beyond this critical speed, obviously the ATP turnover that's required to sustain that speed goes up, and there's a balance point, and there's simply a speed where you can supply all of the energy aerobically. So the delivery of oxygen to your muscles is perfectly matched by the utilization of that oxygen in the muscles. But there comes a point where the demand for oxygen, and this is below VO2 max, although it can be quite close to VO2 max if you're extremely highly trained. But there comes a point at which the demand for oxygen just starts to exceed the amount that's delivered. And so therefore you have to start using some aerobic energy, some anaerobic pathways to generate that energy. But at the same point in time, so imagine your phosphocreatine has reached a steady level. It's lower than it is at rest, but it's still stable, and you're running along at this speed. And now all of a sudden you go beyond your critical speed. You know, you're starting to have to draw upon those anaerobic mechanisms, and so your phosphocreatine concentration drops in the muscle and doesn't stabilize. It's dropping. Remember I said that when your PCR drops, your mitochondria is stimulated to work harder. So despite the PCR dropping and you making some anaerobic contribution, that's simultaneously stimulating the mitochondria to use more oxygen. So we get this inefficiency, we get this drift in oxygen uptake, we get this slow component. Now remember that your critical speed is at a high fraction of your VO2 max already, so you haven't got much room for VO2 to increase before you hit your VO2 max. So all of a sudden, everything's out of equilibrium. You've lost your homeostasis, which of course as humans, as mammals, we always lack homeostasis, whether it's temperature or whether it's acid base or whatever. But we've got beyond this threshold where that's manageable. And it sets off this whole cascade. You could call it a fatigue cascade, but your PCR is dropping. You're also drawing more upon anaerobic glycolysis, so you're producing more lactic acid. So you produce more lactate in your muscles and blood. pH is dropping. All of these things in combination, of course, aren't good for muscle function. Your inorganic phosphate is going up. We know that that can be not advantageous for muscle function. When you're starting to use anaerobic glycolysis, you use muscle glycogen more rapidly. And for longer events, that's not a good thing, because that once you run out of muscle glycogen, you have to rely on fat, and you've hit the wall, and because it costs you more oxygen to generate the same ATP from fat compared to. So all of this stuff's happening, and the same, your VO2 is going towards maximum. You're breathing harder. You're trying to supply more oxygen, so your heart rate's still going up. Your RPE, which is tied to your ventilation, goes up as well. All of a sudden, you realise you're out of control. You're not in control of your breathing anymore. It's in control of you, and you can't speak properly, and you're in trouble. And the further you are above your critical speed, the more rapidly you'll use your D prime, and the quicker you'll become exhausted. And you're fully aware of that. I think psychologically we know it's all scaled. If you're running at a speed just above your critical speed, you can kind of you know intuitively how long you've got. If you're way above your critical speed, you still know how long you've got, and it's less than it was if you're just above you. All of that stuff is going on simultaneously. The other thing that happens, we think, above critical speed is, as the ATP demand goes up, you have to recruit more and more motor units. When you're going at a low speed, those motor units are predominantly comprised of type 1 or slow twitch muscle fibers. Of course, as you go faster and faster and faster, the motor units that you recruit tend to be more type 2 or fast twitch. And those fibers are less well equipped for oxidative metabolism, and they're better equipped for anaerobic metabolism, and they're more fatigable. So you're running into all of this stuff adds, contributes as well. So the fiber, you're desperately trying to add more fibers to enable you to continue to exercise, but those fibers aren't well equipped for the task that you're trying to make them do.
No, that makes a lot of sense, Eddie. I really appreciate you taking the time. It's a Friday evening, and so I really thank you for the time you've given me for the podcast here. Last question for you: what area of research are you really excited about for the next 5 to 10 years in this realm of endurance, performance, integrated physiology, and a metabolic steady state?
Whoa, that's the best question of the night, and it caught me napping there. I think there's a lot more that needs to be understood about critical power and critical speed, and there's been a misconception, because the other threshold that people know about is maximal lactate steady state. Okay, and people can think that maximal lactate steady state and critical speed are the same thing, and they're not quite. They're in the same rough kind of domain, but critical speed is a little bit higher. And we've got a paper that we hope is going to be published quite soon, which shows that you can exercise just above your maximal lactate steady state, as it's conventionally defined at the moment, and still attain a VO2 steady state. So there's a mismatch between what's happening in the blood. Remember, this is just one metabolite, lactate, and you're measuring it in the fingertip or the earlobe, which is way away from what's happening in the muscle. And VO2 is, I think, what's really important. Like we mentioned earlier, if your VO2 behavior predicts behavior everywhere else, especially within your contracting muscle cells. So so you can exercise above your maximal lactate steady state and still be below your critical speed. So I think that's one of the things I'm quite keen for people to understand, is that we either have to redefine maximal lactate steady state, or we have to throw it out and appreciate that it's the critical speed that's really important for this. And it doesn't tell you that you can run for an hour at critical speed. It's not that. It simply separates two domains of exercise. One where you can't reach a steady state, and things will cascade until you become exhausted, and below which you can. Yeah, and that's it. That's all it is. And you should kind of not worry about how long you can run at critical speed for. That's not what it's designed to do. Simply separates two exercise domains where the behavior is entirely different.
Andy, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks very much.